Trinh T. Minh-ha, writer, filmmaker, composer, professor at UC Berkeley in rhetoric and gender and women's studies, writer of many books, Framer Framed, When the Moon Waxes Red, and many others, and also other films. So just to begin, there's lots of people here, so maybe we can do mostly questions, but just to begin, your commitment to the twofold commitment. Wanted to see if you can, because I've seen that twofold commitment yesterday when Naked Spaces, Living is Round, and throughout your career. And so I wanted to see if you can say a little bit more about how the twofold commitment to the subject and also to creativity is present here.
So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have here a situation where all the senses are involved, and the experience that is solicited from you is an experience of the body. But at the same time, as you could see, the subject itself, China of the hinterland, is sensorial China as well. So the subject, what I focus on in the subject is also how I make the film. It informs the way that I make the film. That's one way of looking at the twofold commitment. Another way is to look at or to enter the question of time, because very often people think that 1993, 94, that's the past. So it's, why make a film, from that time? Why not go back, for example, and shoot more footage, compare the past and the present? But when which was something that I thought about at the beginning, but as I look at the footage, I realize that it has its own integrity. It doesn't need, present footage in order to exist. So, in the film you heard, what if the ancient is not past and the modern is neither present nor futuristic? Because we usually have a very linear sense of time and of history. But people all around the world are actually not living with this linear time. They have a sense of time that is very different. And one of the stories that you heard in the film is the grandma's story. How, for example, the officials who came and asked her, how many people are there in this house? It's a huge compound, right? And, she said, but officer, you have to ask when. And then they get offended and they said, they thought they would assist her and said 2, 3, and she get even more offended. She said, I've lived here 50 years, and the number has never been the same, right? People come and go, they leave, they come back, and so on. You can tell right away the different sense of time. So time is not limited to what is visible in her world. Time includes also what is invisible. It's a sense of time that is so much larger than just going around and picking up names and counting the people whom you see on the side. It's almost like a useless way, right, of documenting. But that's how a linear sense of history would inform the way that people go about in controlling. And it's all for the purpose of control. So when I decided to come back to 1993 and 94, I immediately think of the body of films that were made, for example, in China by filmmakers who focus on Shanghai. If you have seen these films, you would notice that most of them are around 1920s to the 1940s, the period when Japanese occupation happened. And so why do these filmmakers choose that period? And it's mainly because during that period, it's also the meeting with Western cultures. And with Western cultures, it's beautiful because you can set up with classic Chinese setting as well as Western setting. The women, for example, are really gorgeous. They are very seductive. They are beautiful. They are clad in such a way that the filmmaker can seduce the audience. But at the same time, it's the time when the Communist Party is at its peak. They are in hiding. They are working for people. They are sacrificing themselves and so on. So there's no this kind of film. On the one hand, it's so praiseful of that period of the Communist Party that it passed censorship. But if you read a second time, or the second layer of what it is saying, is that that's when the Communist Party is at its peak. What about now? What happened to that spirit? So when you are working in a politically sensitive situation, what you are doing that seems to be past is actually a way of dealing with problems that are very present. And here we have the problem of accelerated modernization, the question of urban supremacy, which is all over the world, it's not just China. But the question of accelerated modernization is very much an issue, a contemporary issue in China, and how a number of people, non-Han people, for example, have been forced to live in standardized building rather than living as they lived before. And of course, people would think about it in terms of development. And once more, a sense of development that is very linear. But aside from the question of development, it's not really development that is being brought to people. It's the question of control, how you can control. And that's why in the film, a lawyer was saying that it's very, they are very scared of the countryside, of the rural people organizing themselves. And the question keeps on coming back, why are they so scared? Right? And so, it's really cold.
It's very cold. Adam had a question, and I can pass it on, and I can add to it. The question was about the three voices, you and the other two. And then just to add to that also, I noticed the three different musical expressions, more avant-garde music, more classical Chinese music, and the singing, los cantos. And so if you could say a little bit more about your choices for that sort of acoustic audio world.
So I would first of all about the voices. So you have three women voices and you have a man's voice. The man is mainly the reading of an architect himself. So he actually did all his studies in architecture, and gave information from quoting from Chinese writers. And then you have the three women, and all of them, we can say that they speak in the first person. So who is I? You have the voice of Xiaolu Guo, who is a novelist and also who wrote her memoir here. She's the one who spoke about Xitang and the fisherman's village and her grandmother and grandfather. And then you have Xiao Yui Yang, who is a poet and who's also reading from her book of poetry. And then you have my voice giving reflection, on a number of issues, and sometimes I'm joining with the man's voice because this information, after all, I chose them, right? In order to make the film, in order to bring the film together, I chose this information. So these were the four voices. The singing is actually, I have also 4 women singing, and one of the women is recommended to me by a friend, filmmaker. And so when I first met her, I said, "What can you sing? What kind of song can you sing?" And she said, "Well, I can sing popular songs and so on." I said, "Can you sing folk song?" She said, "Well, from where?" I said, "From mainland China." She said, "Oh, no. No, absolutely not. I'm from Taiwan. So I can't sing anything from mainland." Well, she doesn't want to. And so I said, "Okay, then I'm not too interested in popular songs, but can you perform words? Are the words the same in mainland China and in Taiwan?" She said, "Yes, of course, it's the same." So I said, "Why don't you perform the words?" And I come up with, as you could hear, there are many definitions of what harmony is, and many different situations in which harmony is being brought out. So around the concept of harmony, there are clusters of other terms that are just as relevant, and they are relevant to harmony and disharmony, for example. So I came up with this cluster of words, and just in parentheses, a lot of these definitions are actually inspired by the I Ching. So here you have a cluster of words also that are defined as inspired by the I Ching. And I asked her to perform them, but not just one way, half a dozen of ways each time. So that's why you hear sometimes a different performance of the same word. So this is the role of one of the singers. And the 3 other singers are, well, you can hear by the voice. One is a woman who is elder, and you can hear the kind of voice that she has. And then you have one singer in mainland China. She had to record in mainland China and then send it to me. And then another who is the one whom I mentioned in the film when I was having this acupuncture session. And I heard a voice in the room, and it was suddenly, I was in pain, but when I heard the voice, everything is gone. No pain whatsoever. So I came out and I asked the acupuncturist, I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "Well, it's just a patient, but she forgot to bring money when she came." So I told her, "Since you don't pay, you sing." So I sought her, and she's one of the singers in the film. The most marvelous person for me is the musician, the Wu Wei, who play a dozen of instruments, as you could see, and he even used his voice as well. He can play fluidly classical Chinese music, but he also plays in classical Western orchestra, and he plays avant-garde music. So this is what I immediately feel affinities for, and working with him has been fabulous, as you could hear by the music, even though we had to work long distance, like back and forth and right back and forth.
Should we open it up?
Yes.
Okay.
I was interested in the story of the two boys that were in conflict and they were instructed to sing songs at the same time, full voice. I was curious if you could speak to the inclusion of that story in the film and how you see it related to the theme of harmony throughout.
Yes. Well, first of all, as you can tell in the film, harmony is a term that arises with music. And as the film also says, reality is musical. So harmony arises with music, and it was Confucius who first wrote about harmony. But today, that term is politically heavy because the government has been using it. And as you could hear, netizens actually, every time there is a sensitive word, they say, oh, yes, this word has been harmonized. So anything that is sensitive as issues could be harmonized. And so when you have these two poles, what comes with the music context and what comes with the political context, rather than trying to correct, harmony as we understand it, I would rather multiply all the definitions of harmony to, as you could see, it's a multiplicity of ways of understanding harmony and of practicing harmony. And the story is very symbolic in its scope, because here you have a teacher who, during the war, helped children who are stealing because of hunger. He helped them by making them sing in a choir. But there are two boys that are always in conflict and fighting. So he just took the two boys and put them next to one another and say, okay, you are going to sing each a song, each a different song. And you have to sing full voice, and you have to sing in such a way that you do not sway because of the other singing next to you. And so he challenged these boys, and the two boys start singing loudly, on the top of their lungs. And you can just imagine the situation, because if I were there and someone is singing loudly next to me, I wouldn't be able to keep my tune. I'll just go with the tune of whoever is next to me. Right? So this is what happened in relations of domination and subordination. That the one who is loudest, who is strongest, who is most heard, for example, would make it such that the other kind of follow rather than maintain, for example, your strength. But the two boys actually sung through, and they finished their songs, and at the end the teacher said, well, this was harmony. I thought it was wonderful, because harmony is not the question of being the same or singing the same tune, but here you have harmony as we carry out in our struggle. So for example, in the family struggle, We would want equality, but we don't want equality in sameness. We would like equality in difference. Right? Keep your difference and yet have a situation where social justice, is carried out. So the story, in other words, stands for that, very strongly. Stands for a notion of harmony in which differences are actually the strength of the participants rather than difference as conflict, which is what we usually understand difference for.
I can do another one.
Hello. One back there too. Let's run it up there first, and then we can.
Go ahead.
Sorry, so we got lost in translation there. So not necessarily comparing to specific films, but here I was really entranced by how in certain stories or certain scenes there was a lot of different times folded into the same runtime, and then others where it was more straightforward observation and kind of this way to let our minds and hearts relax in between some denser scenes. So I was curious from your experience as the author of all of this and constructing all of this, how empathy felt different as you created different scenes and structured it together, whether it always felt kind of localized towards the same subject or specific characters, or even dislocated as you went along and discovered the film.
Well, you actually describe it very well, because on the one hand, you have this story, and sometimes, as you said, the story can bring you, and the songs also, right? The songs, you don't have to understand every word to appreciate the songs, and to, just like in the film, it is said that someone sings not because a bird sings not because it has a message, but because it can sing it just sing, or people who can sing a song rather than doing it for some kind of message. So I would say the whole of the film is that way, that you have certain things that are very, that could lead you in many dimensions, many layers of meaning. And then you have other things that are very simple, that does not require any kind of understanding. You can just feel it. That's why I mentioned the sensorial China. And there are many aspects where you can just feel it. The information, for example, are, in my other films, actually I avoid this kind of voice of information. But in this film, now that I've done all these other films, I can bring some kind of information. And as you said it very well, in a way, it doesn't require you to even though I would be so much more excited if I don't understand something and I have to stay with it for a while. But there is also another attitude, which is to just give the information. But this is how we consume information. And hence, rather than simply hear only the information that is given to you, if you put it in the context of where it comes in relation to the image and in relation to the other voices, then you see that it could really expand. So this is how I proceed in the process. Just like with the word harmony, you never get it just one way, so that you have many ways to enter. And depending on your background, your liking, your history, you would come in differently, which is fine. Everyone can have different entries into the film. Here.
Thank you. Hello. I was curious, I know this is kind of a big one, but I'd love to hear anything about your collection process and how you find rhythm in selecting, I wouldn't say necessarily narratively, but it is, like how do you, kind of give so much, so many voices, so many places and times, shape.
I'm afraid that I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, I would love to hear about your selection process, your like collection and selection of, the footage that you collected over time, and I guess like how you find rhythm in your.
How I work with rhythm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, in the film, I did give a number of definitions for rhythm. And once more, if you only listen to the definition, it's just a definition, it's nothing else. But if you start, if you start feeling it in the image, in the sound, in the voice, in the way that things come together, for example, then rhythm is pervasive. It is something that is very vast. It's actually social relations. The way, for example, that each one of us would, like when we speak together and we listen to how the other one is speaking, you would see right away that listening to the other one speaking, listening to the other's music, listening to the other's spacing, and hence listening to the rhythm of the other's way of being, then rhythm becomes something that is very vast. But also, when you work with a film that has no centralized story, so you have a lot of material, and I mainly focus in all of my film on the everyday, the politics of the everyday, not on any specific individual, except for the film that I made, Søni Biết Given Name Nam, where I was dealing with the politics of interviews. And then in that film you have women telling their stories. But the focus is on the politics of interview, of translation and subtitling. Right? So most of the time, I don't focus on individuals because I think that whenever we say I, the I is always collective. Of course, depending on how you feel it, how you live it, how you practice it. The I is always collective because you carry the communal with you. You are not just by yourself. So this opposition between the individual and the societal is a form of individualism that I have very little affinity for. So I don't make films focus on individual story unless that individual allows you to open up to the world, which is a totally different situation, which means that the I of that individual is a collective I. So that's when you focus on someone. But most of the time for me, it's the everyday, the politics of the everyday. And when you have this, how do you put a film together? If you don't have something that is centralized, right? But it's like a tapestry. You have many threads. The threads are all related. If you pull out one, you may have a big hole, in that tapestry. But they all hold together but they don't need, for example, a centralized story. And one of the main elements that allows me to pull together a very large amount of material is rhythm, and how you work with rhythm. So you work with the visual rhythm. When you work with image, you work with visual rhythm. You notice all the movements, in, out, up, down, and so on, of the visual. You listen to music. You listen to the beat of the music. You listen to the way that people speak, and in relation to how you place one voice in relation to the other. For example, if you listen to the three women's voice, Xiao Lu Guo has a British Chinese accent, and Xiao Yuishan, who is from Canada, even though when I contacted her, she was living in Japan. But she has an American accent. And then you have my voice, which is Vietnamese, French, American, and all this kind of sound that is different. Right? How you work these together, how you work the different eyes together, is a way of working with rhythm as well. How one eye relate with the other eye. And then the last thing is when you, and this is something that I feel very strongly, but doesn't have to be a solution for anyone, is that when I work with music, if I have a cut, I emphasize the cut. I never try to hide the cut. So that's why you have these transitions that are very obvious. So transitions for me are wonderful. They are like a world in themselves. So these transitions are very important. They give rhythm to the film. And when you zoom in and zoom out, it's not just a question of focusing on something. It's the rhythm of the zoom in and zoom out. And when you pan, it's also a rhythm of panning. So you have many rhythms that you are working with. So rhythm allows you to bring together, all this material that otherwise would go in all kind of directions. Right?
My question is based off of What About China and also the screening yesterday, Naked Spaces. I'm curious if you could share any rules or ethos that you had set for yourself or your team when you were filming within and filming these communities. I am also curious if you have experienced any violence as the one who carries or as the one who wields the camera. There are many theoretical stipulations about, of course, the violence of the camera as a technology, but I'm curious about your experience.
Why use the term violence? I think that from the very first film that I made, the way that the camera, or the way that the film turned the mirror around, so that you are not just talking about them, but you are talking about yourself. You are talking about us, rather than simply them, for example. That kind of politics of representation I dealt with from the very first film that I did. So rather than speaking about violence, I think there are many different things that are involved. Holding a camera is very voyeuristic. And there's the whole of the history of narratives in mainstream films, for example, is the history of voyeurism. And this is what I brought out in a film like A Tale of Love. That I focused on, it was my first narrative, and immediately what I focused on was the question of voyeurism. Even when I come in people's place, you can see that it is voyeuristic because you go inside and you look at everything around you, right? You go in the dark and you look. But there are also differences. You know, for example, there, rather than simply speaking, and this is a well-known concept that people quote all the time from my films, rather than speaking about people, which is another form of voyeurism, objectifying and talking about people, you speak nearby. And there's the difference right there, because when you speak nearby, it's not anything that is abstract. It is something that you do all the time. If you pay attention, you would see that when you are next to someone who is very close to you, it's very difficult to speak about that person. You are always careful that that person might just turn around and say, no, I'm not that way, and the person would talk back, right? And my mother, for example, if I'm next to her and I'm saying something about her, she'd immediately turn around and say, what's wrong with you? I'm not that way at all. So just imagine the situation where you give information without speaking about people, but speaking nearby. So that's why you have all these stories, right? I'm not saying these people in this house are doing this. This is their habit. This is how they eat. This is how they cultivate. This is how they work. None of that. What you have are stories, songs, things that are very close, for example, to their activities, but that are not simply pointing to it as if it is something that you can objectify. So this is one of the difference, that can be brought out very clearly. And the ethos, I think that at the bottom of everything, I would say that you don't need to go to a place with this attitude that we often have when we are journalists, for example. You go to a place and you have to get that story. You have to catch people in certain ways. You have to catch them unawares. For example, you see that people are totally aware of the camera. And you do that because you stay very long before you even start shooting. So in other words, the film begins before I even touch the camera. I come in and I just look around and the film already begins. By the time I use the camera, people are totally aware of it. You are not catching them unaware. So that's also one situation. And the other situation is that I don't think it is worth doing something if people are not, if they are against it. It's not worth for both sides. It's not worth for you and it's not worth for them. So you have to be in a situation where you feel that there is a kind of mutual agreement, and then you start shooting.
Your responses to the last two questions, I think, helped me formulate mine, which is, so on the one hand, as you suggested, you're obviously interested in the individual as a kind of a gateway onto some form of communal experience, but at the same time, you're pointedly avoiding a kind of ethnographic description of how the community lives, etc. And something that struck me was that it seems that architecture is playing an important role in that approach, in that you pay a lot of attention, both visually and in the narration, to the building, right? That wonderful round structure in which the community lives. and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how the attention to architecture might be a way of approaching the community in a kind of non-violating way in the context of that village, but maybe also at the larger scale of like China, because you're also thinking about how the state is imagined as a kind of structure, right? The structure that frames individual and collective life in a way that's complicated, because the whole question is like, what about China? But then it turns out that, as you mentioned in the film, China as a coherent thing doesn't really exist, right? There are all these. It dissolves into all kinds of local, regional, right, multicultural experiences, but those are still framed by the kind of ideological structure of the state that you talked about quite a lot. So sorry, that was a bit diffuse, but.
Yeah, thank you. I think also that it's not that China does not exist, but China exists in multiplicity. And that's why you have the questions right at the beginning. When, where, which, what about, how, and so on. And one of the most important point also, what about China, is that China is not over there. I think that China is within here as well. We carry China with us all the time. You go out, you eat Chinese food, you are in relation with China. You go out and you buy some little toys made in China, you are in relation with China. So we are constantly, in other words, carrying China with us. It's not as if it is only over there and that it exists without you, for example. So with that, the question of architecture, there is something very interesting in the question you raised, because the question of visibility and invisibility, showing the visible in order to entice the invisible to action. So architecture is the visible aspect. And also I work with Jean-Paul Bourrier, the producer, who is also an architect, visual artist and an architect. So actually he did all the research on indigenous architecture. And he also was helped. The assistant is also, and at the time he was an architectural student, but is now a professor of architecture as well. So we worked together as a team, and he did a lot of the research for that. But also, I remember, how whenever you go to a place, we always have the tendency to say that we have to understand the culture by approaching people. But there is a way of understanding the people by looking precisely at what they have built, and the notion of dwelling, for example, which is at the same time visible and invisible. There are certain aspects of dwelling that is very visible, but the way that we dwell is actually could be quite invisible. Sometimes we don't even know how to dwell. And hence, we feel as if we have no home anywhere. So the question of dwelling is at the core of architecture as well, but dwelling in the larger sense of the term. And so you have a structure that is material, that you can see, but also that shows you how people organize space and what is important, for example, in the way they organize space. So I would say that architecture can tell you so much more about a culture than just trying to talk to people, for example.
Hi. Two things that you mentioned, well, a lot of things that you mentioned really resonated, but I was wondering specifically in terms of the kind of question of time and the circular time, and exploring that kind of in moving image, which makes a lot of sense. And then also kind of being interested in the question of we as opposed to I. I was wondering how both of these things show up in terms of process, the process of making, and also the order of kind of how the different stages of making, whether it's in production or post-production, how they show up, both of these things.
I didn't hear the last question.
How do both circular time and the question of the kind of the we, the community, or the communal, how do they both show up in terms of process, your process or the team's process, whether it's in pre-production, production, or post-production? How does that affect the order, for instance, of kind of what you work on in post-production, or what you film first, or how you think about things first versus second?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
First, I would say I didn't mean anything like circular time. You know, rather, if there is an image that I use, I would say spiral, the spiral, so that you go back but never to the same place. This is what tradition can offer us, not imitating the past or anything that is past, but actually you go back in order to be, every time you go back to a different point. So the spiral is very much what we can compare, you know, the notion of history and of time to, not circular. And the question of process, I have already talked about how I bring together the voices, for example, the many eyes in the film. But if you point to, for example, how we work together, you know, it's for example, you can have an idea, you can suggest the idea, like when I talk about the singer who didn't want to, the Taiwanese singer. You can suggest an idea, but whatever come up would have to be something that comes from her. You know, it's something that she would like to do. So it's not simply a question of asking someone or imposing your idea on someone. So this is like a process that you have to do down to the smallest details all the time. And it could be in the shoot, it could be in the way that the text is written. I wrote something like 700 statements, but I only use not even 1/5 of it, and I throw away the rest. So that also is something that comes with the structuring of the film, and not simply what I decide. You know, the process tells you how you are going to structure the film. And then the question of afterwards, you know, for example, in the editing, when I come to the editing table, you have a soundtrack, you have a visual track, and you have a verbal track, and none of them dominate. So you are not using one to illustrate the other. Like very often you can see that people start with a visual track and then they put sound to it afterwards. In my case, there's no such process. I usually work with the three together. So sometimes it's the image that leads, sometimes it's the sound, sometimes it's the commentary. And none of them, you know, exist in a relation of domination and subordination. They are very related, but they are independent.
I hope this is a short one. My question is, where did the title "What About China" come from? Why did you name your film this? To me, it sounds like it comes from a place of misunderstanding China or overlooking China. But I'm curious where this title comes from.
The title, right? Actually, it is something that has a long history. First of all, it's very simple. The film was made during pandemic time, and every time I go to a group discussion, for example, someone is saying something negative about China. And at the time it was very negative because the whole responsibility of COVID was being put on China, and China is being blamed for it. And for me, of course, it's totally absurd because the situation that we are going through here in the States needs a lot of attention. And instead of focusing on what is happening here, you know, we are putting the blame on others, so that we are just running away from the rain in order to fall right into the river, you know, afterwards. And this situation, in this situation, I usually, when people say something very negative, I say, why? Why only China? What about China? So this is, for me, a very simple, it's very colloquial. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's just a question that comes up. Why, you know, blaming China? And, but of course, there are some film critics who thought that I was taking this title from Roland Barthes. And Roland Barthes wrote a piece that I actually published and have it translated, but I never thought of him, even though I love Roland Barthes. I mean, I like what he wrote. But his piece is Et alors la Chine, which means and then China. And it was written in a context where he was criticizing the way that all the intellectuals, French intellectuals at the time, were becoming Maoists. So it was a totally different kind of context. And again, you know, why would an expression that is so colloquial belong to someone, right? Like to another theorist and so on. So of course that film critic wrote something about it, and it spread. People just assume that this is what the title is, but no, it's something very simple. And then there is the context of China. The film was funded generously by Shanghai, by a museum in Shanghai, and the people there immediately told me, just by your title, we cannot show the film. You know, so you can see the difference in context, right? In the West, with a question mark. What about China? With a question mark. It's a way of opening up so that there are more possibilities, so that you don't just close down. But in another context, just the question mark can be taken negatively. So, but the people who fund this knows how to work with censorship. And even though they cannot show my film, you know, because at the time they were showing a retrospective of my films in a museum, and they had like 5 floors where they are showing the films, and they couldn't show it regularly, but they told me they show it as special event. And the audience is also very smart. Whenever they hear about special events, they go. So I actually heard that there was a lot of people who came to see the film. Maybe we have to. Last question.
I have a somewhat technical question. How did you deal with the degradation of material and the difference in resolution? Did you find that obstacle, or a good challenge to help you build the rhythm that you were talking about?
How I work with the old footage, or different technologies, or?
Right, like the contrast of footage from 30 years ago to new or photography or different ways of handling the footage. Did you find that more inspirational to help with the rhythm that you're trying to build with sound, with music, with images, or did you find it?
No, I think very interesting question. Because I think first of all, both the photograph and the analog high-8 video, which is what I shot on, at the time it was the advent of video. So you have analog high-8 and you have the photograph. They are all the same period. There is not one that is more recent than the other. As I mentioned, when we went there, when I look at all the footage, I decide that I'm not going back in order to update or anything like that, because the footage and the photograph have their own integrity. So it's another way of working with rhythm, because between the relation between photography and video, you can tell it's subtle, but you can tell right away. It's like staying in one place and seeing things moving around you with the still, whereas in the other situation, you are actually moving as if you are still. So it's almost like the opposite way. It creates a dynamism in the rhythm that is very interesting. And that's why, you have this constant move, but the move is very, very different from one media to another. But I did have a lot of difficulty in terms of transferring what I was trying to do with the high-8 footage, right? Because with high-8 footage, when I was working on the transition, and then at the end, when you transfer it for color grading to another computer that is more contemporary, all the transitions were lost. And it was devastating for me because I put so much work in this transition. And at the last minute, I just lose all of them. I had to recreate the whole thing. But that's one of the things that happen when you work with old and new technology, because the marketing mind make everything incompatible. So rather than trying to give us products that we can use, that we can adapt from one time to another, it's very telling of our society, the way that they think about the past or the old or the ancient and everything, right? Incompatible. And this is how the marketing mind dominates. You have to constantly renew, throw away, and so on. So in a way, it's a feat to make it compatible. And in the film, you can hear, the women performing compatibility, pop, 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 just like.
Thank you for the questions. I think it's been a special event to have Trinh T. Minh-ha amongst us today and yesterday. Thank you so much, Trinh T. Minh-ha, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.